You may want to look at 2 Samuel. Turn to chapter 5. We're going to do a review. Look at the highlights of 2 Samuel chapter 5 through 8. I was talking to the class this morning. Isn't this such an interesting part of the Bible? Reading about King David. We know about him killing Goliath and maybe about his sin and how his son Solomon and maybe something about the temple, but there's so much more to his life. And this Bible bowl gives us a chance to go into details here and have a better understanding of David and what happened to him. I was talking to the class this morning. I remember reading and hearing about the stories of Robin Hood and King Arthur and Richard the Lionhearted, and being thrilled with those stories, but I'd already known. My parents had already taught me these stories about David. And when I read those stories, I thought, boy, those are good stories, but they're not good as the stories about David and David being king. And those are real stories, and these others are made up things. And yet we got real stories here about King David. And we've got a lot to come in this as well. So let's go over this. What I've done, we're going to look at just kind of look at the highlights of the story and then read some key verses of each chapter. It's going to be a pretty simple lesson, and we'll review this episode's of David's life here. But let's start with chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, just by way of review. In chapter 1, Saul is dead. And then in chapter 2, David is anointed king over Judah in Hebron, now just the southern tribe of Judah. Abner takes this Bosheth and makes him king over the northern tribes. But then in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we read how Abner was killed by Joab. It was very treacherous, wasn't it? Joab taking him aside, saying, I've got something to tell you from the king, and then taking and smiting him under the fifth rib so that he dies. With Abner out of the way, Ishbosheth is left, but in 2 Samuel chapter 4, Ishbosheth is killed by some of his captains. Remember how they brought his head to David, thinking David would praise them. He said, you mean you killed a man sleeping in his own bed? That David didn't think that was a good way to kill a fella, and he put those two fellas to death. He didn't want his name stained with the treachery that was going on around him. He knew God would make him king in his own time, and so David let God work this out and separated himself from these treacherous men that were thinking maybe either doing him a favor or trying to win his favor, but making that mistake. Now let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 5. In verses 1 through 5, we see David is anointed king over all Israel. They all come down. All the tribes, they come to Hebron. This is the third time David is anointed king, once by Samuel, and then once by the men of Judah to be king over Judah in Hebron. But now he's been anointed king over all of Israel. In 2 Samuel 5, verses 6 through 8, David's men take the city of Jerusalem, a city up in the hills. It's the first time that we read about Jerusalem being called Zion. And about the city of David. It's called the city of David. This is where we read about where he says, if you take Jerusalem, you get up there, get up to Jerusalem by way of the gutter. And we talked about what that gutter was. They found that shaft that they think may have been that gutter, some kind of water shaft running up into Jerusalem that they had left undefended. Jebusites say, you'll have to take the blind and the lame before you take this city. But they can't. They led a troop up that gutter and surprised them and took the city of Jerusalem away from the Jebusites. But then 2 Samuel 5, 11 through 16, David adds to himself wives and concubines while he is in Jerusalem, and began having sons by them. He's got a growing family. But we talked this morning how, a fella, he doesn't need 2 wives. He certainly doesn't need 7 or 8 or 9 or how many David has now at this time. all us husbands know, now a wife is one of our greatest joys that we have. It's one of the great blessings from God. Whosoever findeth a wife findeth a good thing and obtaineth favor of the Lord. But that is a wife. You start adding wives to this thing, and you are adding to yourself troubles. And we're going to see David's going to have troubles because he tried to be like the kings around him and multiply wives to himself. But in 2 Samuel 5, 17 through 25, David fights 2 battles with the Philistines. Something to note. Philistines come up, heading toward Jerusalem. David says, shall I go up? He inquired of the Lord. The Lord said, you shall go up, and I'll definitely deliver those Philistines into thy hand. And the first time was like a breach of waters. He just ran right up onto those Philistines, and he defeated them and ran them off the battlefield. But the Philistines came again. This time they're ready for him. And God told David, you shall not go up. David asked. I said, don't go up. Instead, go around by the mulberry trees. And when you hear the sound of the going from the mulberry trees, then you'll go up. And he went up and defeated the Philistines and drove them all the way back to their cities along the coast. Here's some key verses. The yellow ones are the memory verses. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 1, then came all the tribes of Israel to David and to Hebron and spake, saying, behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. In verse 3, they anointed David king over Israel. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 7, David took the stronghold of Zion. The same is the city of David. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 10, David went on and grew great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. There's an extra R in there. The Lord of hosts was with him. The Lord of hosts was with him. All right, let's go to, more. 2 Samuel 5:12, David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. In verse 13, David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 5:19, David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said unto David, go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into thy hand. And 2 Samuel 5:22, the Philistines came up yet again. 23, David inquired of the Lord. He said, thou shalt not go up, but fetch a compass behind them and come upon them over against the mulberry trees. And then verse 25, David did so as the Lord commanded him and smote the Philistines. Let's go to chapter 6. 2 main things in chapter 6. First, the first 11 verses, David tries to bring the ark to Jerusalem. He wants to do it on a new cart. He didn't ask the Lord about this. If he had inquired of the Lord would have told him how to transport the ark. It's written in the law of Moses. Getting a new cart sounds like good intentions, doesn't it? We'll get a new cart just for this ark. And then they all came with all their instruments of music, and they were just like they were having a parade until that oxen stumbled and the ark rocked, and Uzzah stepped forth his hand to steady the ark, and he touched the ark, which God said not to do. Uzzah was dead. Well, it made David angry, but it also scared him. And David said, how shall I bring the ark up to Jerusalem? He should have asked that the first time. And so 2 Samuel 6 verses 12 through 23, he's going to bring the ark up the way God said to do it. And he brought it up by using the priests. They made sacrifices along the way. And on the way in, he was so joyful, he danced for joy as the ark entered Jerusalem. And Michal, his wife, looked out a window and saw him, and she didn't like the way he was behaving and rebuked him. And David had words with her, and it just destroyed that relationship he had with Saul's daughter, his wife there. Here's some key verses. 2 Samuel 6 and verse 2. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, that dwelleth between the cherubims. In verse 3, they set the ark of God upon a new cart. In verse 6, when they came to Nikon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah. God smote him there for his error, and he died by the ark of God. 2 Samuel 6 and verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how shall the ark of the Lord come to me? In verse 12, it was told King David, the Lord hath blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that pertaineth to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. In verse 14, David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod. In verse 16, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Verse 20, then David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how glorious was the king of Israel today. Now that's sarcasm. How glorious you were. Boy, weren't you the stuff today, she's saying. And she despises him. You just got to think, there's got to be something in Michal's heart here, being the daughter of Saul, and here is David that has displaced him. Something about all this isn't sitting well with her. Well, David turned it right back on her. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord which chose me before thy father and before all his house to appoint me ruler over all the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play before the Lord. The next verse, he says, you think that was bad? I'll be despised even more. I'll act so ugly, I'll despise myself. But all the ladies are going to like me. You know, that's just not any way to talk to your wife, is it? Well, the relationship fell apart. And it says in verse 23, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. Let's go to chapter 7. The main events of chapter 7. David desires to build the Lord a house. The ark had been kept in tents. You remember King Hiram had sent the cedars of Lebanon to David with carpenters and masons, and they built David a house. I bet he liked his house in Jerusalem. He's sitting there thinking, you know, I think I'll build the Lord a house. That was his idea. Well, we read in 2 Samuel 2 verses 4 through 17, the Lord forbids David to build him a house. And the Lord promised to build David a house. Two different meanings of the word house here. God's going to go to Nathan, says, oh, David, go ahead and do it. The Lord be with you. But that night, the Lord came to Nathan and said, no, you go tell David, have I ever asked anyone to build me a house of cedar? Now, just do what I say. David, I'm going to build you a house. But he's not talking about a physical house. He already had a house of cedar. He's talking about his family and establishing his throne, where those would rule forever on David's throne. Well, 2 Samuel 7, 18 through 29, David prays a humble and grateful prayer to the Lord. The reason this is so significant is because of the New Testament teachings on what Nathan told David when he said, I'll be to him a father and he shall be to me a son. Hebrews, the book of Hebrews tells us this is not just Solomon. This is talking about the Messiah that would come. And David recognizes that there's more to this than just Solomon. He's talking about things that would come to pass in a great while to come. And he recognizes that in this prayer. Let's look at some of the key verses. 2 Samuel 7, verses 2 through 5. The king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth in curtains. And Nathan said to the king, Go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee. And it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shall thou build me a house for me to dwell in? You know, we always get this idea, we don't always, and all of us don't, but it's a common thing. I'm going to do something great for the Lord. I'm going to think up something great. When what the Lord wants us is just do what He says. That is what God counts as great. And so David coming up with these great plans and building a new cart. Now I'm going to build a house. And the Lord says, I never told him I'd do that, David. So you just wait on me. Let me decide what we're going to do about this, David. And so, 2 Samuel 7 and verse 11, The Lord telleth thee, He'll make thee a house. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I'll set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I'll establish His kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I'll establish the throne of His kingdom forever. Remember Peter on the day of Pentecost? That the sepulchre of David is with us unto this day. He was sleeping with his fathers, but he's announcing the fulfillment of this when he's talking about the Messiah coming and Jesus sitting at the right hand of the throne of God. And 2 Samuel 7 is that passage that's quoted in Hebrews. I'll be his father, and he shall be my son. The book of Hebrews says he never even said that to any of the angels. In verse 16, And thy house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. And then the prayer. Then went David and sat before the Lord and said, Who am I, O Lord God? And what is mine house that thou hast brought me hitherto? 19, O Lord God, but thou hast spoken also of thy servant's house for a great while to come. In verse 23, And what one nation in the earth is like thy people, even like Israel, whom God went to redeem for a people to Himself and to make Him a name. Now let's get to chapter 8. And David becomes great in chapter 8. David subdues the Philistines, and then the Moabites. And then verses 3 through 8, David defeats Hadadezer. And the Syrians come to help Hadadezer, and David subdues them and recovers his border to the Euphrates River. In 2 Samuel 8, 9 through 11, the king of Hamath sends his son to David with vessels of gold and silver and brass. You see, the king of Hamath, he was fighting against Hadadezer and was worried about him. But since David took him out, he sent David presents. He was glad. This was, later find out, archaeologists have now discovered this was a Hittite king. And that was a great nation up there above David. And so David had friends, powerful friends, to the north of his kingdom. David subdued Ammon and Amalek. Ammon was over there by Moab. Amalek, that's that warring, that raiding tribe that would be out in the Sinai Peninsula. Well, David put a stop to that. He defeats the Syrians in the Valley of Salt. Sounds like the Philistines. Syrians tried it again. David defeats them. And it says that that's when David made a great name for himself after defeating those Syrians a second time. He put garrisons in Edom. And so David's conquered all the land around him. And that's which he has not conquered, like Hiram and that king of Hamath. They're sending presents to David. They're glad to see David prosper like this. And then in 2 Samuel 8, 15 through 18, we read about various men in David's administration. Let's look at the key verses. 2 Samuel 8 and verse 1, David smote the Philistines and subdued them. 2 Samuel 8 in verse 2, he smote Moab. So the Moabites became David's servants. Remember, that's when he had the men line up in 3 lines, and he killed 2 of the lines. He said the Moabites became his servants unto this day. Maybe out of fear, but maybe out of gratitude. He may have been taking out some of those Moabites who were oppressing other Moabites, and they didn't want that either. In verse 3, David smote also Hadadezer as he went to recover his border at the river Euphrates. This is when the kingdom, the old kingdom, reaches its peak under David. David is going to be able to hand this powerful and rich and prosperous and wide-spreading kingdom from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. He's going to hand it over to his son Solomon, who will reign over it for 40 years in its glory. 2 Samuel 8 in verse 6. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became servant to David and brought gifts. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. Verse 10. And Tuai. Now that's the way we're calling his name. And that's what it looks like in the self-pronouncing Bible I have, Tuai. You might think he had 2 eyes, okay? Oh, 2 eye. Maybe he wore glasses. You call them 4 eyes sometimes, don't you? Okay. 2 eye. Then 2 eye sent Joram his son unto King David to salute him and bless him, because he fought against Hadadezer and smitten him. For Hadadezer had wars with 2 eye, and Joram brought with him vessels of silver and vessels of gold and vessels of brass. In verse 11, which also King David did dedicate to the Lord, with the silver and the gold that he had dedicated of all the nations which he subdued. In verse 13, David gat him a name when he returned from smiting the Syrians in the valley of Salt, being 18,000 men. God said in the previous chapter, I'll make thy name great like the names of the great men on this earth. And David's now ranked among those great conquerors and great rulers, because he had beaten those Syrians, beat them twice, and established his kingdom. And then here is the memory verse, verse 14. And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. That phrase is found twice in that chapter. In verse 15, David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. Well, there's the reign. He started off as a shepherd boy. He became a national hero when he killed Goliath and was a very successful soldier and captain and commander in Saul's army, till Saul became jealous and sought to kill David, and David became a fugitive in his own homeland, with Saul chasing after him, but he never caught up with him. When Saul was dead, David became king in Hebron over Judah. And when Saul's son was dead, David became king over all of Israel. And then he expanded his kingdom, defeating the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and then those of Syria and Hadadezer, and all the way to the Euphrates River. And so there's the kingdom, the great kingdom that David had. So that's the summary of what we have. Here's how you win the Bible Bowl. You study it at home. That's right. If you want a ribbon, you study it at home. Okay? You can learn a lot of it here by just coming, but study it at home and you'll learn it better. And I think our team is ready. You should have seen them. We read every verse of every chapter in class and read it fast. And it's fun to watch them read those names fast. And they can do it. Maybe we're raising up some auctioneers here, okay, the way they went through those names. Isn't that wonderful, though, that we're able to study this, and we're going to learn a lot more about David, and a lot of exciting things to come, some very disappointing things, but also some very exciting things. One of the stories I'm looking forward to telling when we get there is when David fights the giants. You know, we know about him killing Goliath. You know, he fought another giant, and this time he almost lost his life. In fact, some of the men had to come to his rescue. And that's where they're going to tell David, say, David, you're too old to be doing this. So, you need to let us take on these giants. You just sit back and let us do the fighting. We don't want the light to go out of Israel. The light to dim from Jerusalem. And so they kind of retired David from his military exploits. We'll read that story about that and other stories about David. But the greatest story is how this is preparing for the King Jesus to come. The first thing it tells us about Jesus in the book of Matthew, that this is the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the Son of David. And Christ is King. You talk about the borders of David's kingdom from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates that lasted, what, maybe 50 years? And the kingdom of Christ, where the knowledge of the Lord is everywhere in the earth, as the waters cover the seas, and that goes on forever and continues to expand and grow every time someone says, I want to be part of that kingdom. I'll repent of my sins, and I'll be baptized into Jesus Christ, and rise from that water, a citizen of God's kingdom. You want to be a soldier in God's army? You want to be a citizen in God's kingdom? Well, that's how you do it. And then you fight the good fight of faith faithfully to the end of your days. You need to do that tonight. You can do it as we stand and sing the invitation song.